The rain has not come in 2 years, and you are walking. You have been walking for days now, across a land the color of old bone, cracked earth, gray thorn, a sky so hard and bright it hurts to look at. Your children are behind you, quiet in the way that hungry children go quiet, which is the worst sound in the world because it is no sound at all. Everything you owned is gone. The little patch of ground you worked is dust. The animals are dead. And the men who own the land, the men in the big houses far away, they are not coming to save you because it has never once in your whole life occurred to them to try. And then, on the road, you hear a rumor. There is a place, they say, out past the dry hills on the bend of a poor river. A man has gathered the lost and the ruined and the forgotten and built a town where no one is turned away, where there is bread, where the powerful cannot reach you. They call it below Monte, the beautiful mountain. And the man who made it, they say, is a saint. So you turn your feet toward it because it is the only hope anyone has offered you in 2 years. You do not know, how could you, that by walking toward that town, you have just become, in the eyes of your own government, an enemy of the nation, that soldiers and cannon are already being sent, and that within a couple of years, almost everyone walking this road beside you will be dead. I taught history in Brazil for the better part of 40 years, and there was one story I kept in a special place. My name is Joaquim. By the way, hello, come and sit. And most of my stories I told to wake a sleepy class up, or to make them laugh. But this one I saved for a different purpose. I saved it for the days when I wanted my students to feel something harder than curiosity. I wanted them, just once, to be angry, the good kind of angry, the kind that makes you pay attention for the rest of your life. Because this is the story of a war that my own country fought against some of the poorest people it had ever produced. A war we started out of fear. A fear of something that, when you look closely, was not really there at all. It is called the War of Canudos, and I am going to walk you through it carefully and honestly, and I am going to tell you plainly where the historians still argue, because the arguing is part of the truth. So settle in. Let me take you back to the driest corner of Brazil, at the very end of the 1800s. First, you have to understand the land, because in this story the land is almost a character. In the northeast of Brazil, inland from the coast, there is a vast, harsh region called the sertao, the backlands. It is a place of thorn, scrub, and cactus and long, killing droughts, where the rain fails for years at a stretch, and the rivers shrink to cracked mud, and the cattle die in the fields. The people who lived there, the sertanejos, were tough beyond anything you or I could easily imagine, leather-skinned, patient, deeply religious, and abandoned almost completely by the wealthy, modern Brazil that sat on the coast looking out at Europe. And I want you to hold those two Brazils in your mind at the same time, because the whole tragedy lies in the gap between them. There was the Brazil of the coast, the cities, the ports, Rio de Janeiro, the gentlemen in European suits who read French newspapers and dreamed of being a modern nation. And there was the Brazil of the interior, the dry backlands, the forgotten poor, a world that the coast barely knew and did not much wish to know. The coast thought of itself as the future. It thought of the backlands, when it thought of them at all, as a kind of embarrassing past that had not yet caught up. That contempt, that is the gunpowder. Everything else is just the match. Now the timing, because the timing is everything. In 1888, Brazil finally abolished slavery, the last country in the Americas to do so, and it did it with a stroke of the pen and no plan whatsoever for what came next. Hundreds of thousands of newly freed people were simply turned loose into a country that had made no room for them, given no land, no work, no place to stand. Many drifted. Many ended up in the poorest, hardest corners of the land. And then, 1 year later in 1889, the whole shape of the country changed overnight. The army pushed aside the old emperor, Dom Pedro II, put him and his family on a boat to Europe, and declared Brazil a republic. Just like that. No revolution in the streets, no great popular uprising. A small group of military men and their allies simply ended a monarchy that had stood for most of a century. And here is the thing about a republic that is born that way, quickly and from the top. It is nervous. It is insecure. It knows, deep down, that it was not really asked for. And a nervous new government sees enemies everywhere, because it is desperate to prove it deserves to exist. Keep that nervousness in mind. A frightened government is a dangerous thing, and this one was about to go looking, in the driest backlands of Bahia, for a monster to slay. And into that cracked and hungry world walked a man. His name was Antonio Vicente Mendes Maciel, but nobody remembers that name. They called him Antonio Conselheiro, Antonio the Counselor, because that is what he did. He counseled. He was born around 1830, and by all accounts his early life had been marked by hardship and private grief, business failures, a marriage that ended in ruin and scandal. And at some point, a broken man, he simply walked away from ordinary life and into the backlands, and he never really came back. For years he wandered the sertao on foot, a thin figure in a long blue tunic, his hair and beard grown long, carrying a staff, eating almost nothing. And as he walked, he preached. He led prayers. He gave counsel to the poor, that is the whole meaning of his name. But he was not only words. Wherever he went, he put people to work doing good and useful things. He rebuilt crumbling churches, he repaired cemeteries, he raised chapels. He mended the broken sacred places of a region the official church had half forgotten. And to the sertanejos who had been abandoned by everyone with power, here at last was a holy man who came to them, who lived even poorer than they did, who asked nothing and gave comfort. You can imagine what that meant. In a land of despair, he was hope with a human face. Now, and I have to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of place where a storyteller can cheat. Conselheiro also preached that the world was ending. His was an apocalyptic millenarian faith. He spoke of the end times, of a coming judgment, of a world about to be turned upside down so that the last would be first. To the coastal elite that would later sound like madness or worse. But you have to hear it the way his people heard it. If your entire life is drought and hunger and abandonment, then a preacher who tells you that this suffering is not the end of the story, that justice is coming, that the meek will be lifted up, that is not madness. That is the only medicine anyone has ever offered you. And then, around 1893, Conselheiro and his followers settled down. At an old abandoned cattle ranch on the bend of a river in the Bahian backlands, a place called Canudos, they began to build a town. He called it Belo Monte, and here is where the numbers start to become genuinely astonishing. That settlement grew and grew and grew. People came from all over the sertao and beyond, the poor, the landless, freed people with nowhere to go, families ruined by the droughts, former outlaws looking to start again, the sick, the desperate, the faithful. Within a few short years, Canudos had swelled to something like 25 to 30,000 people. Let me put that in perspective for you, because it is easy to let a number slide past. That made Canudos one of the largest settlements in the entire state of Bahia at the time, bigger than most proper towns. A city, really, raised out of dust and faith by the poorest people in the country, with no help from any government at all. What was it actually like? It was poor, and it was crowded, and it was deeply religious. The days shaped by prayer, by work, by Conselheiro's counsel. People farmed, they herded goats, they traded, they built. Was it a perfect paradise, the way some romantic tellings would have it? Almost certainly not. 30,000 poor people in a drought-stricken place is hard, no matter who is leading them. But here is what matters, and here is what the coast could not stand. It worked. It fed people. It took the discarded of Brazil and gave them a place to belong. And it did all of it outside the control of the landowners, outside the control of the church hierarchy, and outside the control of the shiny new republic. And that a large, independent community of the poor that answered to no one on the coast, that was the thing that could not be allowed to exist. So now let me show you how a frightened country talks itself into a war. Because this is the heart of it, and this is the part I most want you to understand. Remember, the Republic was new and nervous, and hunting for enemies to prove itself against. And there were people in Brazil who still missed the old emperor, monarchists. They were called, people who thought the Republic was a mistake. Not many of them out in the backlands, mind you, but the fear of them was everywhere in the halls of power. Now, Conselheiro had, in fact, said things against the Republic, but you have to understand the shape of it. When the Republic came in, it brought changes that landed strangely in the deeply Catholic backlands. It made marriage a civil matter of the state rather than only a sacrament of the church. It brought new taxes. It separated church and state. To Conselheiro and his followers, reading the world through their apocalyptic faith, some of these things looked less like modern government and more like the work of an ungodly, even satanic new order. So yes, he denounced the Republic, but he denounced it as a preacher denounces sin, in the language of the end times, not as a general planning a campaign. And this is the crucial thing, so let me say it as plainly as I possibly can. There was no monarchist plot at Canudos. There was no secret army waiting to march on the coast and put a king back on a throne. Conselheiro was not organizing a restoration of the monarchy. Historians are about as settled on this as historians ever get. His movement was religious and millenarian, a refuge and a faith, not a political conspiracy. The people of Canudos wanted to be left alone to pray and to live, but the coast could not hear it that way. To the newspapers and the politicians of the cities, a huge, growing, armed-ish settlement of fanatics out in the backlands, led by a man who preached against the Republic, well, that must be it, mustn't it? The monarchist conspiracy they had been dreading, the counter-revolution, the enemy within, and the more they said it to each other, the truer it felt, and the more the fear fed on itself, until a town of drought refugees and freed slaves and praying grandmothers had been transformed, in the mind of the nation, into a dagger pointed at the heart of Brazil. They invented the enemy, my friend. That is not me editorializing. That is, in sober terms, what the best history tells us happened. A frightened young country looked at its own abandoned poor, and out of its own insecurity, painted them as a mortal threat. And then it went to destroy what it had painted. The first military expedition sent against Canudos at the end of 1896 was small. A detachment of state soldiers, sent to sort out what everyone assumed would be a simple matter of scattering some fanatics. They never even reached the town. The sertanejos met them out in the harsh country that these local men knew like the lines of their own hands, and turned them back. Think about the mismatch here, because it runs through the whole war. On one side, soldiers with modern rifles marching in from outside, sweating in a landscape that was trying to kill them all on its own, the heat, the thorns, the lack of water. On the other side, men who had been born in that land, who could move through it silently, who knew every dry gully and hidden spring, and who were now fighting for their homes, their families, and their saint. The backlanders were poorly armed, old guns, knives, farm tools, whatever they had. But they had the land and they had a reason, and in that country that counted for an enormous amount. So the government sent a second expedition, bigger than the first. Hundreds of soldiers now with artillery, a proper military column marching on this troublesome town. And this one got closer. It actually fought its way toward the settlement. And it too was beaten back. The sertanitos harried the column, ambushed it in the broken country, wore it down, cut it off from water and supply, and eventually the second expedition also turned around and retreated in disorder. Twice now, the poorest people in Brazil had defeated the army of the Republic, and you can feel, at this point, the fear on the coast curdling into something worse, into humiliation. Because a nervous government can survive many things, but it cannot easily survive looking weak. Every defeat at Canudos was now not just a military problem but a wound to the nation's pride, and to the Republic's fragile sense that it deserved to rule. The newspapers screamed. If a band of backwoods fanatics could beat the army twice, then the monarchist threat must be even greater than anyone feared. You see how the logic works. Every piece of evidence that Canudos was just tough and cornered was read instead as proof that it was strong and dangerous. The story had taken on a life of its own, and the story now demanded blood. So for the third expedition, the Republic sent its sharpest blade. His name was Colonel Antonio Conselheiro, and he was, in a sense, the perfect man for a frightened government to reach for. He was a hardened, iron-willed officer with a fearsome reputation for ruthlessness, a reputation dark enough that he had earned, in some tellings, the grim nickname of the head cutter. He was a fervent believer in the Republic, exactly the sort of man who saw enemies of the state and wanted them crushed without hesitation or mercy. He was sent to Canudos in early 1897 with a strong, well-armed force and a simple mission: end this, quickly and finally. And Conselheiro was so confident, so certain that this rabble would collapse the moment a real soldier arrived, that he drove his men hard across the exhausting backlands and threw them almost straight into an assault on the town. He would sweep in and finish it in a day or two. That was the plan. It went catastrophically wrong. The attack on the settlement around the 6th of March, 1897, broke apart against the defenders. The sertanitos fought street by street, house by house, with a ferocity born of defending their homes and their faith. And in the middle of that assault, Conselheiro, the Republic's chosen blade, the man who was going to end it all, was struck down and mortally wounded. He died there. And with their commander dead, his column lost its nerve and its shape, and it fell apart, and the survivors fled back the way they had come, abandoning weapons and cannon as they ran. Sit with that for a moment. The third expedition, the strongest yet, led by the most feared officer the Republic could find, had not merely failed. It had been shattered and its commander killed by a town of the poor. When the news of Conselheiro's death reached the coast, the country did not respond with reflection. It responded with panic and with rage. If even he could be destroyed, then surely, this was no mere village of religious peasants. This had to be the great conspiracy, funded from abroad, armed in secret, the monarchist counter-revolution in the flesh, ready to bring down the Republic itself. In some cities, mobs attacked and wrecked monarchist newspapers, hunted for traitors, whipped themselves into a fury against enemies they could not see. And I want you to notice what has happened, because it is one of the oldest and saddest patterns in all of human history. The fear had now completely detached from the facts. The truth that Canudos was a cornered community of the desperate, fighting only to be left alone, had become literally unsayable. The nation had told itself a story about a mighty enemy, and each defeat, instead of correcting the story, had only made the nation believe it more fiercely. The bigger the humiliation, the bigger the imagined monster had to be to explain it. There was now only one way the story could end: total destruction. The fourth expedition was not a police action. It was a war. The Republic now committed a huge portion of its army to wiping Canudos off the map. Thousands upon thousands of federal troops, drawn from across the country, under the overall command of a general named Arthur Oscar, with modern rifles and, crucially, heavy artillery, real cannon, brought across that brutal landscape at enormous effort, for the express purpose of pounding a town of the poor into rubble. This was by now one of the largest military efforts the young republic had ever mounted, and it was aimed inward at its own people. And even then, it was not quick. Through the middle months of 1897, the army laid siege to Canudos, and the defenders held. They held far longer than anyone on the coast could believe. They knew the ground. They fought from the maze of their own mud-brick houses. They made the army pay for every step. The soldiers, for their part, suffered terribly too, from the fighting, from the merciless sun, from thirst and hunger and disease in that unforgiving country. It became a long, grinding, agonizing siege, the great modern army of the nation held at bay for months by the poorest people it possessed. But there is only one way a siege like that can end. The artillery did its work. The town was encircled, cut off, slowly crushed, and by the early days of October 1897 it was over. Canudos fell and it was razed. The houses pulled down and burned. The town wiped from the earth so thoroughly that it was meant never to rise again. Conselheiro himself did not live to see the very end. He had died during the siege, worn out, some weeks before the final fall. And the defenders, the men of Canudos, by every account fought on almost to the last, defending the ruins of their beautiful mountain to a degree that stunned and disturbed the very soldiers who defeated them. A student of mine, a sharp girl named Beatriz, who never let me get away with anything, once put up her hand right about here and asked me the question that always comes. "Professor," she said, "why did they not just leave? When they saw the whole army coming, the cannon, the thousands of soldiers, why did these people not simply walk away into the backlands they knew so well and save their own lives?" And it is a good question, an honest question, and I want to answer it for you the way I answered it for her. Leave for where, child? These were people who had already lost everything once, who had walked away from ruined lives and dead land, and come to this one place that had finally taken them in. Below Monte was not a fort they were defending. It was the only home the world had ever given them, and the man who built it was, to them, a living saint, and their faith told them that to stand here was to stand with God at the end of all things. You do not walk away from that. You do not, when you have nowhere on this earth left to walk to. They stayed because staying was the only dignity they had left, and that answer, I noticed, kept Beatrice quiet for a long, long while. I am going to spare you the worst details of how it ended, because I promised myself long ago that I would tell this story with dignity and not with gore, and because the grief of it does not need decoration. It is enough to say this: how many people died at Canudos we do not truly know. The numbers are genuinely debated by historians to this day. The counting was never properly done. The records are poor and estimates run wide. But whatever the true figure, it was a catastrophe. A whole town of the forgotten gone. And the enemy they had all died fighting, the great monarchist conspiracy, the dagger at the heart of the republic, had never actually existed. Now this whole terrible story might have simply vanished, just another massacre of the poor, unrecorded and unmourned, the kind of thing that happens and is forgotten. And I would not be telling it to you today, except for one man who was there and who could not forget. His name was Euclides da Cunha. He was an educated man of the coast, trained partly as a military engineer, working as a journalist, and he went out to the backlands as a war correspondent to cover the fall of Canudos for a big newspaper. And I have to be honest with you about the shape of it, because accuracy is the whole point of this channel. He did not witness the entire war. He arrived late, near the end of it, and much of what he later wrote came from months and years of careful research afterward, reading the reports, gathering the documents, walking the ground, thinking and thinking about what he had seen. And Euclides da Cunha had gone out there believing the story of the coast. He believed more or less that Canudos was a nest of dangerous fanatics that needed to be put down. That is the man who arrived. But that is not the man who left, because what he actually saw broke the story open in his hands. He saw the tenacity, the humanity, the sheer desperate courage of the sertanejos. He saw the suffering on both sides. He saw a great modern nation grinding its own abandoned children into the dust in the name of a threat that dissolved the closer you looked at it. And it changed him. Years later, in 1902, he published a book about it, called Os Sertos in English, usually Rebellion in the Backlands, and it is one of the foundational works of all Brazilian literature, a strange and towering thing, part history, part science, part reportage, part anguished poetry. In it, Da Cunha does something that took real courage. He turns the accusation around. He says, in effect, that the crime at Canudos was not committed by the backlanders. The crime was committed against them, by the coast, by the modern republic, by his own educated, European-facing Brazil, which had marched into the interior to slaughter its own people and called it civilization. He framed the whole war as a crime of the coast against the sertao. I will be careful and fair even here because I owe you that. Scholars will tell you that Da Cunha's own thinking is tangled and that it evolved as he wrote. He carried the racial theories and the contradictions of his age, and the book wrestles with them, sometimes uncomfortably to a modern reader. His view of these events was not fixed and simple. It shifted and deepened. But the beating heart of the book, the thing that has made it immortal, is that thunderclap of a reversal. The enemy was us. We did this. To our own. And that, my friend, is the part they leave out of the schoolbook. So let me gather this up, because I have taken you a long way into the dust, and I do not want you to leave with only the sadness. I want you to leave with the thing that actually matters. The reason I saved this story for the days I wanted my class to be awake. For years my students would hear this and ask me the natural question, the one you may be asking now. How? How does a country do this? How do reasonable people, newspapers, generals, a whole modern nation, convince themselves to send cannon against praying farmers and freed slaves, and believe right to the end that they are the ones defending civilization? It sounds at a distance like a kind of madness, but it was not madness, and that is the frightening part. It was something far more ordinary than madness. It was fear, meeting contempt and telling itself a story. Here is what I came to understand. standing in front of that classroom year after year. A frightened new republic needed to feel strong, so it needed an enemy. And there, conveniently far away, was a population it already looked down on: the poor, the black, the backward, the ones who did not fit its shiny European dream of itself. And it is astonishingly easy, it turns out, to take people you already hold in contempt and turn them, in your own mind, into a threat. Not because of anything they have done. The people of Canudos wanted only to be left alone, but because of what you need them to be. The monster was not out there in the sertao. The monster was the story the coast needed to tell about itself. Canudos just happened to be standing where the story landed. And now I turn it toward you because I did not walk you through all of this just to make you sad about Brazil in 1897. Look at your own time. Look at your own country, whatever it is, and your own screen and the voices in it. And ask yourself honestly, how often are we still doing exactly this? How often does a frightened people, needing someone to blame, reach for the group it already distrusts? The poor, the foreign, the different, the far away, and quietly, almost pleasurably, turn them into the enemy that explains all our fears. How often does each new piece of evidence that these people are just people get folded, somehow, into proof that they are dangerous? The machinery that destroyed Canudos was not some ancient thing that died in the backlands. It is running right now, in your feed, in your politics, maybe even, if you are honest, somewhere in your own chest. That is why I saved this story. Not so you would pity the sertanejos, though God knows they earned our sorrow, but so that the next time you feel a nation or a crowd or your own heart beginning to build an enemy out of the people it already looks down on, some small voice in you might whisper, "Remember Canudos. Look again. Look closer. Make sure the monster is actually there before you march." I genuinely want to hear from you on this one, so tell me down in the comments, and I do read them. First, the honest question. Had you ever even heard of the War of Canudos before today? Because most of the world has not, and I would love to know how far this forgotten story has traveled. And second, the harder one, the one I really care about. Can you think of a time in history, or in your own lifetime, or in your own country right now, when a people invented an enemy out of its own fear? Do not name it to start a fight. Name it so we remember the pattern. I will be reading. And if this story moved you, if you did not know that 30,000 of the poorest people in Brazil built a city out of faith and dust and were destroyed for the crime of existing where they were not wanted, then do me one small kindness and subscribe, because my country is full of stories exactly like this one, buried under the ones that were easier to tell, and I intend to dig up every last one of them for you. My name is Joaquim. Thank you for sitting with me. And the next time you hear someone tell you, with great certainty, exactly who to be afraid of, think of a beautiful mountain in the backlands and look again.